If you sign that tonight, you won't have a company by morning. The sentence landed softly, almost swallowed by the low hum of conversation and the muted clink of crystal glasses, yet it cut through the air with a precision that didn't belong to a place like this. Ava Brooks stood still beside the table, a tray balanced lightly in her left hand, the weight barely noticeable compared to the sudden stillness pressing against her chest. The private dining room on the 42nd floor overlooked a glittering stretch of Manhattan, where headlights streamed like veins of light through the city below, but inside, everything felt suspended, as if the skyline itself had paused to listen. Richard Cole didn't look up at first. His pen hovered just above the paper, a custom Mont Blanc catching the warm amber glow of the chandelier, his reflection faintly mirrored in its polished surface. Around him, men in tailored suits leaned back in their chairs, confidence draped over them like expensive fabric, their voices moments ago filled with numbers, projections, and quiet certainty. Ava's eyes stayed on the document near his hand, the clause she had glimpsed earlier still echoing in her mind like a warning bell she couldn't unhear. She had seen that structure before, years ago, buried in a case study that had unraveled an entire firm, the kind of detail most people skipped because it looked harmless at first glance. But harmless wasn't the same as safe. Richard finally glanced up, his gaze cool, measured, scanning her not as a person but as an interruption, something out of place in a room designed for power. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, not amused, not curious, just dismissive. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice even, controlled, carrying the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to raise itself to be heard. A few of the executives shifted in their seats, exchanging quick looks, their expressions flickering between confusion and mild amusement. Ava felt the heat rise at the back of her neck, but her voice didn't waver. "Clause 17, she said, gently setting the tray down on the edge of the table, her fingers steady against the polished wood. "It transfers full liability if the partnership defaults." Silence followed, thin and fragile. Someone let out a soft chuckle. Another leaned forward, glancing briefly at the document before leaning back again, unconcerned. Richard's smile sharpened, just slightly. "And you gathered that?" he said, tapping the paper once with his pen. "While serving water?" The room relaxed, tension dissolving into quiet laughter, the kind that filled spaces without asking permission. Ava didn't move. The city lights shimmered behind her reflection in the glass wall, outlining her figure in gold and shadow. "I've seen it before," she replied, her tone calm, almost too calm for someone standing where she was. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in Richard's eyes, not doubt, not yet, but awareness that something unexpected had entered the room. Then it was gone. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, the sound measured, final. "I think you're mistaken," he said, sliding the document slightly forward, reclaiming the moment as if it had never slipped. "And I think," he added, his voice softer now, edged with something colder, "you should focus on your job." The words settled heavier than the silence that followed. Ava nodded once, a small motion, almost invisible, but her eyes lingered on the paper for just a second longer before she reached for the tray. Outside, a faint reflection of lightning flickered across the horizon, too distant to hear, but close enough to be seen, like a warning no one else had noticed yet. The laughter faded behind her as the door closed with a soft click, sealing the room and everything inside it away like a decision already made. Ava Brooks walked down the service hallway with measured steps, the rubber soles of her shoes barely making a sound against the polished floor, but her heartbeat echoed louder than anything around her. The tray in her hands felt heavier now, not because of its weight, but because of what she had just done. The corridor stretched long and narrow, lined with stainless steel carts and quiet doors, each one leading to another world she was not meant to enter. The scent of roasted meat and butter lingered in the air, mixing with the faint hum of refrigeration units and distant kitchen chatter, but her mind stayed fixed on the contract she had seen, the numbers, the structure, the pattern that refused to let go. She had not imagined it. She knew she had not. At the end of the hallway, she pushed through the double doors into the back kitchen, where bright white lights erased the softness of the dining room and replaced it with sharp clarity. Plates moved fast, voices overlapped, and orders were called out in steady rhythm, a system that did not pause for doubt. "Table 12, where have you been?" her manager called, not looking up from the screen in front of him. Ava set the tray down carefully, aligning the glasses as if precision could quiet the tension in her chest. "They are fine," she said, her voice even, though her fingers curled slightly against the edge of the counter. The manager nodded once, already moving on, already focused on the next task, because in this space, what had just happened did not matter. What mattered was timing, efficiency, silence. Ava stepped aside, reaching for a clean cloth, but her gaze drifted to the small monitor mounted above the prep station, where a live feed from the dining room flickered in muted tones. She could see the table, the same one, the same group, their movements reduced to gestures without sound. Richard Cole leaned forward again, pen in hand, the document back in front of him as if nothing had interrupted the flow. One of the executives gestured toward a page, confident, assured, the deal already living in their minds as something complete. Ava felt a slow breath leave her chest. She had said enough. More than enough. And still, something inside her resisted the idea of letting it go. The memory surfaced without warning, sharp and clear, of a dim apartment years ago, papers spread across a worn kitchen table, her father's voice low and tired as he explained how a single clause had undone everything they had built. It had not looked dangerous then either. It had looked like language, like formality, like something no one needed to question. Until it was too late. Ava blinked, pulling herself back to the present. A server brushed past her, carrying a tray stacked high with entrees, the heat rising in waves that warmed the air between them. "You good?" the server asked quickly, not stopping. Ava nodded. "I am fine," she said, though the words felt thinner than they sounded. She glanced at the monitor again. The pen was still hovering. The room still moved in quiet agreement. Outside, through the narrow window above the sink, the sky had darkened, clouds gathering low and heavy over the city skyline. A faint roll of thunder followed, distant but steady, like something approaching whether anyone was ready or not. Ava turned back to her station, picking up another tray, forcing her hands into motion, into routine, into something she could control. But in the back of her mind, the image stayed fixed, the ink that had not yet touched paper, the decision that had not yet been made, and the quiet certainty that when it finally was, it would not unfold the way anyone in that room expected. The storm did not arrive all at once, it gathered in layers, slow and deliberate, like a decision forming behind closed doors, and by the time Ava stepped back into the dining room with a fresh tray balanced against her palm, the atmosphere had shifted in a way most people would not notice but she felt immediately. The air carried a tighter edge, conversations more clipped, movements more precise, as if the room itself had narrowed its focus around the table by the window. Richard Cole sat exactly where she had left him, posture unchanged, shoulders squared with the quiet certainty of someone who had never needed to hesitate for long, but now the pen in his hand rested against the paper without moving, tapping once, then again, a soft, rhythmic sound that did not match the earlier confidence. One of the executives leaned in, pointing to a paragraph with a controlled smile, speaking in a tone that suggested reassurance. But Ava caught the flicker of impatience beneath it, the kind that surfaced when control felt just slightly out of reach. She approached the table carefully, placing a glass of water beside one of the men, her movements steady, invisible by design, yet her attention remained fixed on the document, on the same page, the same clause that had refused to leave her thoughts. The numbers aligned too perfectly, the language too polished, a structure built to look balanced while quietly tipping everything in one direction. She stepped back, but did not turn away immediately. Richard's gaze shifted, not fully to her, but enough to acknowledge her presence again, and for a brief second, something unsettled passed through his expression, not doubt, but a recognition that her words had not completely disappeared. He lowered his eyes back to the paper and flipped the page, slower this time, scanning line by line instead of skimming, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Across from him, a man adjusted his cufflinks, glancing at his watch, the subtle signal of urgency pressing against the room. "We should move forward," the man said, voice smooth, practiced, carrying the weight of expectation more than suggestion. Another nodded in agreement, leaning back as if the outcome had already been decided hours ago. Ava stepped away, retreating into the soft shadow near the wall, but her eyes did not leave the table. Outside, the skyline dimmed further as clouds swallowed the last traces of light, the city shifting from gold to gray in a matter of minutes, reflections in the glass turning sharper, colder. A faint streak of lightning traced the horizon, silent but unmistakable. Inside, Richard exhaled slowly, pressing his lips together before bringing the pen back to the page. His hand paused again, hovering just above the signature line, the smallest hesitation, almost invisible, but it was there. Ava felt it like a pulse, that fraction of a second where everything could still change. Then one of the men across the table leaned forward, offering a small nod, a silent push. The moment closed. The pen touched the paper. The sound was almost nothing, a soft scratch of ink, but it carried through Ava's chest like a final note that could not be undone. She lowered her gaze, turning away this time, her reflection briefly catching in the darkened glass as she moved toward the service door, the city lights flickering behind her like distant signals no one had chosen to read. Behind her, the conversation resumed, lighter now, relieved, as if a burden had been lifted, as if the storm outside belonged to another world entirely. But Ava knew better. Some storms did not make noise when they arrived. Some simply waited until everything was in place, and then they took what they had been promised. The rain began before anyone inside noticed, a soft tapping against the floor-to-ceiling glass that blurred the skyline into streaks of silver and shadow, and by the time the dessert plates were cleared, the city outside had dissolved into something distant and unreachable. Ava moved through the dining room with the same quiet precision, collecting empty glasses, folding napkins, resetting the table as if the moment that had just passed carried no weight, but her mind tracked the rhythm of the room behind her, the subtle changes that followed a decision sealed in ink. Richard Cole stood now, jacket buttoned, posture sharp again, the earlier hesitation buried beneath the familiar confidence he wore like armor, yet there was something different in the way he held the folder at his side, his grip firmer, almost protective, as if the paper inside had suddenly gained a gravity he could feel but not fully name. Around him, the executives spoke in low, satisfied tones, their laughter lighter, their movements relaxed, already shifting their attention to the next opportunity, the next calculation, the next room where outcomes could be shaped. Ava stepped aside to let them pass, her gaze lowered, her presence fading into the background the way it always did, but as Richard walked by, he slowed for just a fraction of a second, his eyes flicking toward her without turning his head, a brief, almost involuntary acknowledgement that lingered longer than it should have. Then he moved on, the moment gone, absorbed into the flow of the evening. The elevator doors closed on their reflections, sealing them into a descent that would carry them back into a world of contracts and consequences, while Ava remained on the 42nd floor, surrounded by the quiet aftermath of decisions made far above her place in it. In the kitchen, the pace had softened, the rush easing into a steady cleanup, the clatter of dishes replaced by the low hum of machines, and the occasional scrape of metal against porcelain. Ava rinsed a glass under warm water, watching the droplets slide down its surface in slow, uneven paths, her thoughts drifting back to the numbers, the structure, the imbalance hidden beneath polished language. She reached for a towel, drying the glass carefully, aligning it with the others in perfect rows, each one identical, predictable, safe. Across the room, the small monitor still flickered, now showing an empty dining area, chairs pushed in, table reset, no trace of what had taken place except the faint impression left behind in memory. Her manager passed by, glancing at the clock, then at the staff, already calculating closing time, payroll, the next shift. "We are done here in 10 minutes, he said, voice neutral, routine. Ava nodded, setting the last glass in place. Outside, the rain intensified, the sound deepening against the windows, a steady, unbroken rhythm that filled the silence between movements. She stepped toward the narrow window near the back, looking out at the city now washed in gray, headlights stretching into long, distorted lines across wet streets, the world below continuing forward without pause. Somewhere down there, the signatures were already moving through systems, through approvals, through channels that would carry them into reality by morning. Ava exhaled slowly, her breath fogging the glass for a brief second before fading. She had done what she could. She had said what needed to be said. The rest no longer belonged to her. Yet the certainty remained, quiet and unwavering, that what had been set in motion would not unfold gently. Some outcomes did not announce themselves with noise or urgency. Some arrived in silence, building beneath the surface until the moment they could no longer be ignored, and when they did not ask for permission. Ava turned away from the window, reaching for her coat, the fabric cool against her fingers, grounding her back into the present, into the simple reality of a shift ending, a night closing, and a world that would look very different by the time. The rain stopped falling. By the time Ava stepped out into the street, the rain had settled into a steady, soaking rhythm that wrapped the city in a quiet blur, the kind that softened edges but never erased what was underneath. The cold air pressed against her skin as she pulled her coat tighter, the fabric damp almost instantly, but she did not rush. Around her, people moved quickly beneath umbrellas, headlights cutting through the mist in long streaks of white and red, taxis splashing through shallow pools along the curb, the world continuing forward with its usual urgency. Ava walked toward the subway entrance 2 blocks down, her steps measured, her mind still holding on to the image of the pen touching paper, the moment that could not be undone. Somewhere above the streets, in glass offices and polished conference rooms, that signature was already traveling, moving through digital systems, through approvals and confirmations, turning from ink into consequence. She reached the corner and paused briefly as a gust of wind pushed rain sideways, tapping sharply against the metal signpost beside her. Across the street, a large digital billboard flickered, cycling through advertisements before settling on a financial news segment, the muted video showing a panel of analysts speaking with controlled intensity, their expressions serious, their hands moving in precise gestures. Ava watched for a second, though she could not hear a word, and something in the tone, in the urgency of their movements, made her chest tighten slightly. Then the image changed, replaced by another ad, bright and irrelevant, and the moment passed. She descended into the subway, the noise shifting from rain to the echo of trains and footsteps, the air warmer, heavier, carrying the scent of metal and damp concrete. The platform was crowded, people standing shoulder to shoulder, staring at their phones, their faces lit by small screens that reflected pieces of a world constantly updating, constantly moving. Ava stood near the edge, her gaze drifting across the line of commuters, each person wrapped in their own thoughts, their own concerns, unaware of the quiet chain of events already unfolding. Above them, a train roared into the station, wind rushing ahead of it, pulling at her coat as it slowed. Doors opened with a mechanical chime, and the crowd shifted forward, stepping inside without hesitation. Ava followed, finding a place near the pole, her hand wrapping around the cold metal as the train lurched back into motion. The lights inside flickered once, then steadied, casting a pale glow over tired faces and distant eyes. Across from her, a man in a dark suit scrolled through his phone, his brow furrowed, his thumb moving faster as he refreshed the screen again and again. For a brief second, Ava caught a glimpse of a headline before the motion of the train shifted her view, but the words that registered were enough to send a quiet pulse through her chest. Market uncertainty. Unexpected exposure. Investigation pending. The man exhaled sharply, leaning back as if the air had suddenly grown heavier, and Ava looked away, her reflection faintly visible in the darkened window beside her, layered over the blur of tunnels rushing past. She did not need to see more. She already knew. Above ground, in offices that had felt untouchable just hours ago, conversations were changing, voices tightening, questions rising where certainty had lived. The structure she had recognized was not waiting. It was already doing what it had been built to do. Ava tightened her grip on the pole as the train picked up speed, the rhythmic clatter of wheels against track filling the space around her, steady and inevitable. Some consequences did not wait for morning. Some began the moment the decision was made, moving quietly, efficiently, until the point where they could no longer be contained. And as the train carried her deeper into the city, away from the glass towers and the quiet room where it had all begun, Ava closed her eyes for just a second, not in fear, not in doubt, but in the quiet recognition that what had been set in motion would now unfold exactly as it was meant to. Morning did not arrive with light. It arrived with noise, sharp and layered, the kind that built before the sun had a chance to settle over the skyline, and inside a high glass office overlooking the same rain-soaked city, Richard Cole stood perfectly still as the first call ended in silence that felt heavier than any words that had come before it. The screen in front of him still glowed with a paused video feed, the face of a legal advisor frozen mid-sentence, mouth slightly open, eyes tight with something between urgency and disbelief. His hand remained on the edge of the desk, fingers pressed flat against the cold surface, as if grounding himself in something solid, while everything else shifted beneath him. Another phone began to ring almost immediately, then another, overlapping tones filling the room in uneven rhythm, each one demanding attention, each one carrying a piece of something unraveling faster than it should have. He reached for one, answered, listened, said nothing, then lowered it slowly as his jaw tightened. Across the office, a large screen flickered through financial data, numbers updating in rapid succession, red replacing green in quiet, relentless waves, each change small on its own but impossible to ignore when taken together. The deal that had felt controlled, measured, inevitable only hours before now moved in a direction no one in that room had prepared for. A clause had been triggered. A condition activated. The liability had not waited. It had shifted exactly as written. Richard turned slightly, looking out through the glass wall where the city stretched below, gray and distant, the rain still falling in thin, steady lines that blurred the edges of everything. His reflection stared back at him, sharper than the skyline behind it, composed, precise, but something beneath it had changed. Not panic. Not yet. But recognition. A memory surfaced, uninvited, quiet but persistent, a voice from the night before, steady, certain, saying something no one else had said, something he had dismissed without pause. He exhaled slowly, pressing his lips together as another notification flashed across the screen, an alert marked urgent, then another, stacking in rapid succession like signals no one could silence. His assistant stepped into the doorway, stopping short as if sensing the weight of the room before speaking. "They are asking for an emergency review," she said carefully, her voice controlled but thinner than usual. "Regulatory flags just came in." Richard did not respond immediately. He watched the numbers shift again, a line dropping faster than the rest, then stabilizing for a fraction of a second before continuing downward, the pattern repeating, precise, inevitable. "Get legal on the line," he said finally, his voice low, measured, but stripped of the ease it had carried the night before. The assistant nodded and stepped back, already moving, already reacting, because the moment for certainty had passed. Richard remained where he was, eyes fixed on the screen, but his mind had shifted elsewhere, back to a quiet dining room, to a glass of water set carefully on a table, to a sentence spoken without hesitation in a place where it did not belong. He could hear it now with a clarity that had not been there before, each word landing differently, no longer an interruption, no longer a mistake, but something else entirely. Outside, the rain continued, steady, unbroken, as if the city itself had settled into a rhythm that did not change for anyone. Inside, the consequences had already begun to take shape, not loud, not chaotic, but exact, unfolding line by line, clause by clause, just as they had been written. And for the first time in a very long time, Richard Cole stood in a room where control did not belong to him, where the outcome was no longer something he could decide, only something he would have to face. The calls did not slow down, they multiplied, stacking over each other until the silence between them disappeared completely, and by mid-morning the office no longer felt like a place of control, but a space reacting in real time to something already out of reach. Richard Cole stood at the center of it, not moving much, not speaking more than necessary, but listening with a focus that sharpened every word coming through the line. "The exposure is larger than projected," one voice said, tight, controlled. The liability clause is binding across all subsidiaries. Another call came in before the first had fully ended, and then another, each one confirming the same pattern from different angles, different departments, different systems that all led back to the same point. The structure had not failed. It had worked exactly as designed. The problem was who it had been designed for. Richard moved to the large screen, his reflection cutting across columns of shifting data, watching as internal alerts turned into external signals, as what had been contained within contracts began to surface in markets, in reports, in places where consequences became visible. A news banner rolled across one of the smaller monitors near the corner of the room, muted but impossible to ignore, the words bold and direct. Corporate exposure triggers investigation. Shares slide on unexpected risk transfer. He did not need the volume. He understood enough. Behind him, the door opened again, this time without hesitation, and his legal team stepped in, files already in hand, faces set in expressions that no longer tried to hide the urgency. "We need to unwind this," one of them said immediately, placing a stack of documents on the table, flipping to a page marked with bright tabs. "There may be a narrow window if we can prove misrepresentation." Richard looked at the page, then at the clause beneath it, the same one, the same structure, the same language that had seemed routine just hours ago. "It is not misrepresentation," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "It is precision." The room fell still for a second, just long enough for the weight of that realization to settle. The clause had been written clearly. It had been read. It had been signed. There was no mistake to argue. Only a decision that could not be reversed. Another notification flashed across the main screen, this one marked with a level he had not seen in years: regulatory escalation, automatic review, triggered not by speculation but by data that aligned too cleanly to ignore. His assistant stepped closer this time, holding a tablet, her voice lower now, as if lowering it might soften what she was about to say. "They are requesting a statement," she said. "Press is already calling." Richard did not take the tablet. He remained focused on the screen, on the numbers that no longer needed interpretation, only acknowledgement. The room around him continued to move, voices overlapping, documents sliding across the table, decisions being suggested, rejected, replaced, but he stood in the center of it as if the noise had shifted to a different frequency, one he no longer needed to hear. Instead, another sound returned, quiet but unmistakable, the memory of a voice that had cut through a room in a way none of this had managed to do. Not loud. Not forceful. Just certain. He closed his eyes for a brief second, the image clear now, the tray in her hand, the way she had not stepped back even when the room had turned against her words. When he opened them again, the screen had updated once more, another drop, another confirmation, another piece of something already set in motion reaching the surface. "Find her," he said suddenly, the words cutting through the room in a way nothing else had. The legal team paused, his assistant looked up, and for the first time that morning, every movement around him stopped. "The waitress from last night," he added, his voice steady now, not louder, but sharper. "Find her." No one asked why. They did not need to. Because in a room filled with data, contracts, and consequences, there was now only one missing piece that mattered, and it was not written in any document, not recorded in any system, but it had been there, spoken clearly, before any of this had begun to unfold. The restaurant opened again that evening as if nothing had changed, the same soft lighting casting warm reflections across polished wood, the same quiet music threading through conversations that never rose above a careful murmur, the same rhythm of service moving forward without hesitation. But Ava Brooks felt the difference the moment she stepped back onto the floor. It was not in the room itself, not in the arrangement of tables or the scent of fresh bread carried from the kitchen, but in the subtle shift of attention that followed her, a glance held a fraction too long, a whisper that paused when she passed, the quiet awareness that something unseen had begun to ripple outward. She adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, grounding herself in routine. In the familiar weight of a tray balanced against her palm, in the simple act of moving from table to table with purpose and precision. The city outside had cleared, the rain replaced by a cold, sharp air that made the skyline appear closer, more defined, each window reflecting a world that continued forward regardless of what had shifted beneath it. Ava moved toward the far side of the room, setting down a glass of water with steady hands, her expression calm, her posture unchanged, but her mind remained clear, settled in a way that did not need reassurance. She had seen this before, not in scale, not in consequence, but in pattern, in the quiet moment where something hidden revealed itself too late to stop. Near the entrance, the door opened with a soft push, and the flow of the room shifted almost imperceptibly as a figure stepped inside, not with the ease of a guest, but with the weight of someone who had crossed a line they could not return from. Richard Cole paused just inside the doorway, his presence drawing attention without effort, but it was not the confidence that marked him the night before. His suit remained sharp, his posture controlled, but the stillness around him carried something different, something stripped down to purpose. Conversations dimmed slightly, not stopping, but bending around him as he scanned the room, his gaze moving with intention, not searching for opportunity this time, but for a person. Ava saw him before he saw her. For a brief second, she remained where she was, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, her breath steady, her expression unchanged. Then his eyes found her. The distance between them was not far, but it felt measured in something deeper than space, in the shift between what had been dismissed and what now mattered. He walked toward her without hesitation, each step controlled, deliberate, the noise of the room fading beneath the quiet certainty of his movement. Ava did not step back. She did not move forward. She simply waited, her posture open, her gaze level, as he stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the restaurant continued around them, glasses clinking, voices murmuring, footsteps passing, but the space between them held its own silence, separate, defined. Richard exhaled slowly, the breath measured, as if choosing his words with a care that had not existed the night before. "You were right," he said finally, his voice low, steady, carrying no defense, no justification, only acknowledgement. Ava's eyes remained on his, not searching, not questioning, simply present. "I know," she replied, her tone quiet, not sharp, not soft, just certain. The simplicity of it settled between them, heavier than any explanation could have been. Richard nodded once, a small motion, but one that carried more weight than any agreement he had signed. "I need to understand it," he said, the words precise, stripped of ego, of assumption, of the distance that had defined him before. Ava glanced briefly toward the table she had just left, then back to him, her expression unchanged. "You already do," she said. "You just did not listen." The truth of it did not land as accusation. It landed as fact. Richard's gaze lowered for a fraction of a second, then lifted again, clearer now, as if something had been removed rather than added. Around them, the room continued, unaware or choosing not to see the shift that had taken place in the space of a few quiet sentences. Ava picked up her tray, her movements smooth, unhurried, returning to the rhythm of her work as if nothing had interrupted it, but the air between them remained altered, no longer defined by distance or dismissal, but by something far simpler and far more difficult to ignore. Recognition. And for the first time since the night before, Richard Cole stood in a place where the truth had not needed power to be heard, only the willingness to face it. The restaurant settled into a quieter rhythm as the evening stretched forward, the earlier tension dissolving into the soft cadence of ordinary moments, glasses lifted and set down, footsteps crossing polished floors, the low hum of conversations blending into something almost indistinguishable from the background music. Ava moved through it all with the same steady presence, her hands precise, her pace unhurried, each motion practiced and grounded, as if nothing in her world had shifted, even though something undeniably had. The overhead lights cast a warm glow across the room, reflecting gently off silverware and glass, turning every surface into a soft echo of movement and light. Near the window, the city stood clear again, rain gone, the skyline sharp against the night, each building outlined in quiet confidence, as if the storm had never passed through at all. Richard Cole remained where he was for a long moment after she stepped away, his posture still, his hands resting loosely at his sides, no longer reaching for a phone, no longer commanding the space around him. The noise of the room returned gradually, not because anything had changed, but because he was no longer holding it in place. He turned slightly, his gaze drifting toward the glass wall where his reflection met the city beyond, and for the first time, he did not look at it as something to control or measure, but simply as something that existed beyond his reach. The weight that had filled his office that morning was no longer sharp or urgent, but it had not disappeared. It had settled into something quieter, something that did not demand reaction, only recognition. Across the room, Ava paused briefly at a table, adjusting a napkin, aligning it with careful attention, the small movement deliberate, almost meditative. Her reflection flickered faintly in the glass behind her, layered over the lights of the city, blending the inside and the outside into a single, quiet image. She did not look back. She did not need to. The distance between them was no longer defined by position or status, but by something simpler, something already resolved. Richard took a slow breath, the kind that did not rush in or out, but settled somewhere deeper, steadying rather than shifting. The room continued around him, unchanged, indifferent, moving forward in the way it always had, but he stood in it differently now, not above it, not outside it, but within it, part of the same rhythm he had once overlooked. Near the entrance, the door opened briefly as another guest stepped inside, a cool draft of night air brushing against the warmth of the room before the door closed again, sealing the space in quiet continuity. Ava moved past him once more, carrying an empty tray, her steps light, her expression calm, her presence neither seeking attention nor avoiding it. For a brief second, their paths aligned, not intersecting, not colliding, just passing within the same frame of motion, and then she continued on, disappearing into the soft movement of the room as naturally as she had always belonged there. Richard remained still, his gaze following only for a moment before returning to the reflection in the glass, where the city lights stretched endlessly into the distance, steady, unchanging. No words followed. No resolution needed to be spoken. The sound of a single glass being set gently onto a table carried through the air, clear and precise, then faded into the quiet rhythm of everything else continuing forward, as if the world had simply absorbed what had happened and chosen to move on, leaving behind only the stillness where something had been understood at last.